In 2019, the median net worth of self-employed Americans was $380,000. The median net worth of employed Americans was $90,000. Same Federal Reserve data set, same economy, same years of work available to both groups. Kevin is the 90,000. He does not know why yet, but the Federal Reserve has been tracking the reason since 1989. Kevin is 34, makes $78,000 a year, has $22,000 in student debt, $31,000 in a car loan, and a mortgage he started 3 years ago at $1,750 monthly. His total net worth is approximately $47,000, mostly the equity in his house, minus what he still owes on everything else. He has a 401k. He tracks his net worth in a spreadsheet. He updates every January. The number goes up a little each year. He feels like he's on the right trajectory. He is on a trajectory. The question is, which column of the Federal Reserve data it leads to at 64? What I am about to show you about the $400,000 gap between Kevin and the median self-employed American at the same income level is going to feel wrong. It contradicts everything you were told responsible wealth building looks like. Here's why the data says it is true anyway. By the end of this, the gap between the sequence Kevin followed and the sequence that produced $380,000 in median net worth is going to make you genuinely angry. Not at Kevin, at the system that called his sequence responsible while documenting the gap in federal publications for 35 consecutive years without ever putting it in a press release. The financial advice industry does not profit when you build business equity first. It profits when you build mortgage debt first. That is a $12.8 trillion market with commission structures built around one specific asset sequence. Kevin followed it perfectly. The Federal Reserve data shows exactly where that leads. Most financial advice in America starts in the same place. You finish school with debt you did not so much choose as receive. You get a job. You buy a car because the transportation is not optional. Eventually, you buy a house because home ownership is what building wealth looks like in this country. You open a retirement account because your employer offers the match. You invest in index funds when something remains at the end of the month. Each step felt like a deliberate choice. None of them were presented as part of a sequence with a documented outcome. The Federal Reserve tracks the outcome. The outcome has a name. This is what I call the approved asset sequence. Student debt first, car loan second, mortgage in your 30s as the primary wealth building vehicle, 401k running alongside it, index funds if anything is left. The system approved each of these for Kevin in exactly this order. The bank approved his student loan before he had income. The dealership approved his car loan before he owned a single asset. The mortgage lender approved his home purchase before any financial institution on earth ever handed Kevin the paperwork for a business credit line. Kevin did not design the sequence. He was processed through it. Kevin at 34 has completed 3 of the 5 steps. $22,000 in student debt from a degree he finished at 22, $31,000 in a car loan on a vehicle worth approximately $22,000 today, $1,750 monthly going into a mortgage on a house that has appreciated roughly 6% since he bought it. Total net worth, $47,000, 12 years in the workforce, solid salary, 0 steps skipped. Kevin did every single thing the sequence required of him. Here is what the sequence never showed Kevin. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, published every 3 years and tracked since 1989, measures median net worth across employment types. The 2019 data, cited officially by the SBA Office of Advocacy in a published document, shows self-employed households at a median of $380,000 and employed households at $90,000. The gap appears in every edition of the survey going back over 3 decades. Same economy, same available years, 4 times the wealth. The differentiating variable is not income. It is which type of asset was built first. Kevin's spreadsheet is correct. It updates the right number every January. What it does not show is which asset category is driving the trajectory and which column of the Federal Reserve data that trajectory arrives at by 64. The mechanics of how that gap gets created across a career are more specific than most financial content will ever show you. That is what comes next. Here is the real math on what the approved asset sequence actually costs. Kevin bought his house 3 years ago, call it $300,000. At 4% average annual appreciation, which is the historical rate in Federal Reserve housing data, that house will be worth approximately $443,000 in 20 years. Over those same 20 years, Kevin pays $1,750 monthly to the mortgage lender. Total payments across 30 years come to $630,000. Most of the early payments are interest, not equity. In 20 years, Kevin has meaningful home equity. Meaningful is not the same as 4 times the national employed median. Now, run those same 20 years on a different starting asset. A one-person service business generating $40,000 in annual profit that Kevin reinvests into the operation. Not a startup, not a corporation. A consulting practice, a skilled trades business, a service operation run out of a home office. In 10 years, at median growth rates for small service businesses in SBA data, that business holds between 150 and 250,000 in sellable equity. In 20 years, Kevin has either sold it and redeployed the capital, or it is worth considerably more. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances does not separate self-employed Americans by business size, revenue, or number of employees when documenting the wealth gap. The 380,000 versus 90,000 median net worth appears across sole proprietors, freelancers, consultants, and service providers of every scale. The variable is the asset category, not the business complexity. Not because building a business is magic, because an asset that scales with the value you create compounds differently than an asset that scales with a housing market index on a 30-year government-guaranteed timeline. Think of it this way. Kevin is building net worth the way you fill a bucket through a faucet with a fixed rate. Water comes in on schedule every month. The bucket gets heavier slowly. You know exactly what it will weigh in 30 years. Now think of business equity as a faucet you can turn up. The flow rate is variable. It responds to the value you create. You can open it wider as you build skill and reputation and systems. Home equity tells you the answer on a 30-year schedule. Business equity asks what you can build before the schedule runs out. The Federal Reserve has been measuring which faucet fills the bucket faster for 35 years. The data is not ambiguous. Two brothers, Jason and Tyler. Same family, both starting at 25, making $62,000 a year. Jason follows the approved asset sequence. Car loan at 25, mortgage at 32, 401k from that point forward. Disciplined and consistent at every step. Tyler does something different. At 26, he starts a small service business on evenings and weekends. By 29, it generates enough to matter. He delays the mortgage until 36, after the business has built sellable equity. At 45, Jason has a house with roughly $200,000 in equity, a 401k with $130,000, and savings. Total net worth approximately $330,000. Tyler has a comparable house, a business he could sell for over $350,000, and similar retirement accounts. Total net worth above $650,000. Same family, same starting income, same years, one variable, which asset came first in the sequence. You have now seen the real math on what the approved asset sequence costs, compared to a different first asset over the same 20 years. The person who has seen those two trajectories next to each other is already operating with a different map than the person who has not. That distinction does not disappear. Subscribe and hit the bell. What I'm about to show about the concentration of business equity across wealth brackets is the piece that makes the commission structure of the financial advice industry impossible to ignore after you have seen it. The math of the approved asset sequence is published every 3 years. The reason most people never see it next to the business equity data is not that the research is complex. It is that the financial press covers what the financial advice industry advertises on. The reason the approved asset sequence persists across generations is not ignorance. The people who follow it are not uninformed about finance. They are responding to a combination of cultural and psychological signals that make the sequence feel like wisdom rather than a documented path to a documented outcome. Understanding that distinction matters because the solution to a knowledge problem is different from the solution to a structural design problem. Homeownership in American culture carries emotional weight that no other financial transaction matches. Behavioral economics research documents this consistently across income brackets and education levels. The feeling of signing mortgage papers activates identity and belonging in ways that opening a business credit line does not. Kevin experienced that at 31. The emotional reward was real. The problem is that emotional reward and wealth accumulation trajectory are two different metrics, and the Federal Reserve tracks the second one. It feels like you finally made it when the house keys land in your hand in the parking lot of the title office, and the agent takes a photo for the file. It feels like the car payment is just the unavoidable monthly cost of getting to the job that pays for everything else. It feels like starting a business is the kind of move you make after the mortgage is stable and the kids are settled and the 401k is finally at 6 figures. It feels like you are doing everything right because your mortgage statement arrives on schedule every month and your 401k balance goes up every quarter. And every person you respect most did it in exactly the same order. That last one is the structural mechanism. When every person in your social network follows the approved asset sequence, the sequence stops being a choice and starts being the landscape. This is not personal weakness. It is social proof operating on financial behavior, which the Journal of Consumer Psychology has documented across income brackets for decades. The behavior your peer group normalizes is the behavior your brain categorizes as correct, regardless of what the Federal Reserve's asset composition table says about outcomes. Let me put a specific person in this. Amanda is 39. Software engineer making $96,000 a year. She has thought about building a consulting practice on the side. Every time she got close to doing it, the same thought stopped her. She cannot afford to risk what she has built, a house with equity. A 401k at $112,000. Technically, Amanda is building wealth. In practice, she is protecting the slower scaling asset while categorizing the faster scaling one as a threat to her security. The Federal Reserve data has a column for that framing. It is the 90,000 median, not because Amanda lacks discipline, because the approved asset sequence handed her home equity first and called it foundation, while framing business equity as a departure from safety. The framing did the work, the credit structure started. Drop a comment. At what age did you first hear business equity compared directly to home ownership as competing wealth-building vehicles? The Federal Reserve has published this comparison in every survey of consumer finances since 1989. Most people encounter it for the first time in a video like this. I want to see where this audience starts. Not financial advice. Research independently. Moving on. So you now understand why the sequence feels inevitable. The credit system delivers access in that order. The culture reinforces it. The emotional rewards are real and documented. The behavioral explanation is clean and satisfying, except the behavioral explanation is the cover story. Here's the structural mechanism underneath it. Let me show you what the approved asset sequence produces at the end of the career, because the number is specific, and it is in the same Federal Reserve data that published the 380,000 versus 90,000 gap. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances from 2022 shows the median retirement savings for Americans between 55 and 64 years old is $185,000, not total net worth. Retirement savings, specifically. After 40 years of following the approved asset sequence, after doing everything the system presented as responsible, $185,000, at a 5% withdrawal rate, $185,000 generates $771 per month. $771 per month. After 40 years of work, Kevin is on trajectory for that number, not because he failed, because the sequence gave him the slowest scaling asset first and called that the foundation. On the other side of the Federal Reserve data, the median self-employed American at the same career stage holds $380,000 in total net worth. At the same withdrawal rate, the difference in monthly retirement capacity is more than double, not from higher annual income, from building a different first asset that scaled differently across the same 40 years. Here is the data point that belongs in every financial literacy course in America, and is in approximately none of them. In the 2019 Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, 45% of households in the top 10% of net worth held business equity as part of their asset composition. 3% of households in the bottom 25% held business equity. 3%. Most people push back when they see that number. I'm putting it here anyway because the Federal Reserve dataset does not adjust based on how uncomfortable the concentration is. 3% is near total exclusion of one asset class from the bottom wealth bracket. Not by accident, by sequence. The households that ended up in the top 10% built a different type of asset. The households in the bottom 25% followed the approved asset sequence with near complete consistency. That is what 3% means. It is a documented outcome of asset sequence tracked across 35 years of federal surveys. Remember the gap from the introduction? The $400,000 difference between Kevin and the median self-employed American at the same income level? Here is exactly where it went. 40 years of compound growth on the slower asset. Mortgage interest to the lender? Car loans on vehicles that depreciated to zero. The approved sequence consumed it one approved step at a time. You might be thinking that you cannot start a business, that it requires capital you do not have, time that does not exist, or a risk tolerance you were not born with. The Federal Reserve data does not support that framing. The Survey of Consumer Finances does not separate self-employed Americans by business size, revenue, industry, or number of employees when documenting the gap. The 380,000 median includes sole proprietors with 0 employees. It includes consultants working from a spare room. It includes people who built a service operation while still employed full-time. You do not need a corporation. You need a different asset earlier in the sequence than the mortgage industry presents it. Let me show you this at human scale. David is 47. He spent his career following the approved asset sequence without skipping a step. Got the degree, got the mortgage, got the car, maxed the 401k. His net worth today is approximately $240,000. His neighbor, same age, same neighborhood, ran a one-person consulting practice for 15 years alongside his career. Fixed costs were minimal. He drove a used car and rented until 38. His net worth today is above $500,000. David knows his neighbor is not dramatically smarter or harder working. What David does not know is that his neighbor built a different first asset. The Federal Reserve has been tracking that pattern across millions of households for 35 years. If the mechanism is becoming visible in a way it was not before, You now have a different view than most people watching their net worth spreadsheet update every January. The person who has seen the asset composition table next to the outcome data is not carrying the same map they had when they started this video. Now here is the part of the Federal Reserve data that ties the mechanism to the system that recommends the sequence. In 2022, for the first time in the documented history of the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the median debt held by self-employed Americans was lower than the median debt held by employed Americans. $99,000 versus $110,000. The group that ended up with 4 times the median net worth carried less debt, not because they avoided borrowing, because they borrowed for a different asset. Self-employed Americans in that data held their largest liabilities in business lines of credit. Employed Americans held their largest liabilities in mortgage and home-related debt, followed by student loans. The structure of what you owe is a direct map of which asset you are building. Kevin owes on a house and 2 consumer products. The person at $380,000 in median net worth owed on a business. Different liability, different asset, same economy, the same outcome documented across 35 years of the same federal survey. This is not speculation. Here is what the SBA Office of Advocacy published in an official government document, citing the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, that has never been placed in the same sentence as the commission structure of the financial advice industry by any major financial channel. The SBA documented the $380,000 versus $90,000 gap as evidence for policies supporting self-employment access. The Federal Reserve published the asset composition data showing business equity as the primary differentiating variable across wealth brackets. Neither publication was ever placed next to the fact that the $12.8 trillion mortgage market, whose origination generates commission for financial advisors, is the exact product the advice industry recommends as the foundation of wealth for employed Americans. Business equity generates no origination commission. Mortgage origination generates a fee at signing. The sequence that the Federal Reserve data documents producing 4 times the median net worth is not the sequence that maximizes revenue for the system presenting the options to you. Kevin's spreadsheet goes up every January. He feels the trajectory. The Federal Reserve publishes where that trajectory ends in every edition of the Survey of Consumer Finances. The tables Kevin never saw next to each other are on different pages of the same document. Subscribe and hit the bell. Next video goes through what the Federal Reserve asset composition data shows about retirement gaps by asset type over 35 years. No motivational content, just the tables and what they mean. The $400,000 gap between Kevin and the median self-employed American is not a talent gap, not a discipline gap, not a risk tolerance gap. It is a sequence gap. Building business equity before or alongside the mortgage, before home equity becomes the dominant asset in your portfolio, consistently produces higher median net worth at the same income levels across every edition of the Survey of Consumer Finances since 1989. The approved sequence delivers the slowest scaling asset first. It calls that responsible. The data has been calling it a 4 times gap since before Kevin was in the workforce. You have now seen the Federal Reserve tables, the SBA documentation, and the asset composition breakdown that the financial advice industry never places in the same room. The person who has seen those 3 things together, who understands that Kevin's spreadsheet is tracking the slower column and knows why the faster column was never presented as an option, is not operating with the same map they walked in with. Most people have heard that home ownership builds wealth. Fewer have read the document where the government's own Small Business Administration published the gap between home ownership as primary asset and business equity as primary asset. You just did. While Kevin is 64 with $185,000 in retirement savings after 40 years of following the approved asset sequence, the mortgage industry collected $630,000 in total payments on his 30-year loan. The car finance industry collected approximately $51,000 across vehicles he no longer owns. The financial advice industry never showed Kevin the Federal Reserve table, where his median sits at $90,000, and the self-employed median sits at $380,000. That table does not generate a commission. The asset he built first, home equity, slowest scaling vehicle in the Federal Reserve dataset. The business equity he never built, $290,000 in documented median net worth differential at the same income level. The car payments across his 30s, $51,000 in capital allocated assets he no longer owns. The mortgage payments across 30 years, $630,000 to the lender, total nearly $1 million. Kevin did not make bad decisions. He followed the approved asset sequence exactly as it was designed to be followed. The mortgage industry will keep calling homeownership the foundation of American wealth. The financial advice industry will keep selling the sequence that generates their revenue. The Federal Reserve will keep publishing the Survey of Consumer Finances every 3 years, with the asset composition data on the pages the financial press does not cover. None of that changes because you watched this video. What changes is that the sequence now has a name, a 35-year documented outcome, and a commission structure that explains why it was presented as the responsible path. Sometimes the smartest move is recognizing that the approved sequence was approved by people who profit from your following it. You do not have to build assets in the order they hand you the paperwork for. The approved sequence was approved by the wrong people.